So in this page, let's implement getStaticProps because we want to first pre-render this page. Now let's do what we know already, which is exporting a function getStaticProps. And we need to return props from here. And in this case, let's call this prop as coffee store because this is a coffee store. This is an individual coffee store page, right? And for the value of the coffee store, remember it needs to be the content of the coffee stores. So in index page, we could easily pass in data directly because we wanted to render all the different coffee stores from this JSON file, right? But in the case of a individual page, what we need to do here is we need to find which coffee store it is that we want to render, right? Because the content of one coffee store for a dynamic route can be different. So for example, our coffee store, Strangelove, can be different than Dark Horse, right? Because the name is different, the image is different, and eventually the contents of the page would be different as well. But we do want to pre-render them. So what we want to do here is we want to first import our JSON data that we did, right? That we used earlier. So we can say coffee stores data from and one directory back, data / JSON, right? And here, instead of returning all the elements in the array, right, from our JSON file, so in here, instead of returning both of these, for route 0, we want to return this content, and for route 1, we want to return this coffee store. So in order to do that, we need to essentially find it and then return it, right? So we can do coffee store data.find, and we can say, and this find function allows us to return the value of the first element in the array. So in this case, the minute it finds the ID 0, it's going to return this immediately. So let's go ahead and do that. We can say coffee store because it's an individual store, right? And we can say return coffee store.id should be equal to the ID, the dynamic ID, right? Over here, it should be a dynamic ID that we used in our page. So it should be 0 or 1 and so on, right? But how can we get the dynamic ID? Now, in our client side component coffee store, we could use useRouter because useRouter allowed us to get the router query ID, right? But getStaticProps runs on the server. So what we have available on the client won't be available on the server, right? So how can we make sure that we can access the ID? Now, getStaticProps allows us to also access params. So all we need to do is params, just like that, right? And this would be equivalent to, let's say, static props. And we can say params equals static props.params. But alternatively, we can also destructure it directly right here and we can access it. But we can stick to this for now. Now, once we do have params, we can just directly access ID from there on. So we can just say params.id. But before we do this, let's make sure that we console log params. And for now, we can just return 0 as an ID. Because we do know that 0 exists. So for every page content, 0th element would be returned first. So let's go ahead and try that out. Now, if we go back and go to Strangelove Coffee, and and nothing really happened. So let's refresh the page. And you can see that it's complaining that get static paths is required for dynamic SSG pages and is missing for this dynamic page. So this is what we wanted to do anyway, right? But it's great that Next.js also gives us this error so that in case you forget, you do remember that for a dynamic route, along with get static props, we also need to implement get static paths to pre-render the paths. Otherwise, Next.js is not going to know which paths to pre-render. All right, so let's go ahead and implement get static paths so we can move further along. Now, we need to find dynamic ID right here, but we'll come back to that. Now right here, let's go ahead and export a function, get static paths. This is exactly how get static props looks like. And we can just return paths directly. So paths are something that we do need to return to Next.js, right? So in this case, it would be 0 or 1 or something, right? 0 or 1 ID, or if we had a second path, a third path, then we could just add 2 as well. So let's take a look at the documentation to understand paths better. Now in our docs for get static paths, it says that we need to return paths, and the paths is going to be returning params ID as values. So paths is essentially an array, and we do need to return a object with the key params with that specific ID itself. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's just copy this code and go back to our VS Code, and we can say just like that, and we can get rid of the additional paths that I copied. Now over here, since we have 2 paths, we can just say 0 and 1 as an ID, right? All right, beautiful. We just return the paths, and this is an array of objects, which matches similar to what we did over here as well, which is an array of objects. So now let's go ahead and try it out in the browser to see if it still complains. Now if we go back to the browser and it's refreshing, and it complains again that the fallback key must be returned from get static paths. Now, what is a fallback key? We'll take a look at in the next lesson.